before we get too deep into communism, we're gonna have a little bit of fun tonight. And gonna make a little confession here and admit something that probably a lot of my comrades in Denver know, but maybe some of you guys don't. And that's that I'm what you guys would probably call a super basic girl. I love overpriced oat milk lattes. I go to Target as a form of therapy, although I use self-checkout, so it's kind of communist. And then for the past 2 years in a row, I've been in the top 0.03% of Taylor Swift listeners on Spotify. And I'm on track to surpass that perhaps this year. It's a little embarrassing, and like my heart is pounding just saying this to a room full of communists for a couple reasons. First is my understanding that Marxists are supposed to be intellectually above things like Kesha and Bravo TV. Another reason is that as a Marxist, I know much of popular entertainment and culture is manufactured on behalf of capitalism. It's not only created for profit, but it's also created as propaganda to reinforce the system as a whole through its messaging. You only need to look at every spinoff of CSI to see both the art for profit as well as the propaganda. Or we can look at an entire genre of Disney manufactured teen girl pop that was popular when we were all growing up, to see how it reinforces harmful patriarchal stereotypes as well as child exploitation on behalf of these childhood Hollywood entertainment factories. And in participating in that, am I not also kind of reinforcing the system? As a Marxist, shouldn't I be able to see through the culture factory aspect of it all and instead seek art and entertainment that is independent and authentic, whatever that means, and not produced with profit in mind? It's something that I think about all the time, and I think I'm probably not alone. So, although Marx and his comrades were deprived of Britney Spears' second studio album, Oops, I Did It Again, they still engaged with some popular culture of their time, just enough to give us some groundwork to start tackling this issue. So we're going to start with an overview of consumerism, since I think many of us will agree that mass entertainment produces quite a lot for us to consume. A lot of today's anti-capitalism is tied up in anti-consumerism, and I think we need to take a closer look at that. Then we'll talk a little bit about the pop culture industry and the contradictions inherent in consuming mass-produced entertainment under capitalism. Finally, we'll arrive at the solution, which I'm sure most of us know, a mass movement from below for socialism that will allow us to throw off the shackles of capitalism and consume and create art and entertainment beyond our wildest imaginations. So before we get super into it, I just wanted to define what I mean when I say pop culture is specifically cultural products that have been created by kind of this entertainment industry and marketed by mass media from the top down, with the intent of mass consumption. This particular form of entertainment media is definitely being presented to us as a commodity, so that's why we're going to start with consumerism. So as I mentioned, consumerism is often considered to go hand in hand with anti-capitalism. However, the two aren't actually as interchangeable as many of them make them out to be. To illustrate this, we can look at one of our favorite cornerstones of American capitalism, the Protestant work ethic. Idolized by capitalists everywhere, the Protestant work ethic encourages frugality, discipline, and hard work just for the sake of work. This view asserts that we should delay gratification in pursuit of endless accumulation of capital and focus on working as a means of fulfillment. From this position, consumption in excess is frivolous and it's a waste of time. Following along with our pop culture theme here, we can see this sort of attitude of capitalists expressed in one of the most famous capitalists, Scrooge. In his human and duck form, he's one of the most famous caricatures of a wealthy person, and he specifically hates Christmas because of its focus on excessive mass consumption and reckless spending. If you're out spending money or hanging out with your family, you can't be doing his favorite thing, working. As we know, ghosts eventually bully him into sharing his wealth, but I don't think we can rely on that for us. Secondly, as we can see all around us right now, capitalism is actually very compatible with austerity and scarcity, which are the exact opposites of consumerism. The ruling class routinely deploys cycles of scarcity and necessity to restrain the material desires of the working class in response to the endless boom and bust cycles that they themselves create. These are necessary for capitalism to continue working for the ruling class, and they underscore the fact that in our society, production is not for human need or even desire, but rather for profit. So consumerism and capitalism, not quite as hand in hand as we often assume. After all, our man Scrooge here hated it, And if the ruling class controls it for maximum profit instead of actual need or demand, then we know that our wants are not what's taken into consideration. Marx also agrees that the two are incompatible. Useless or frivolous consumption and the expansion of needs and desires of the working class wasn't something that he was against at all. He actually felt that consumption was underdeveloped under capitalism because while it does expand our imagination and our desires, it also limits, regulates, and polices our ability to meet those needs. For Marx, a fundamental argument against capitalism is actually that it restrains the consumption of the masses and limits it by tying it to the relentless profit accumulation of the system. In the third volume of Capital, Marx writes that the ability of society to consume is determined neither by the absolute power of production nor by the absolute power of consumption, but rather by the power of consumption within a given framework of antagonistic conditions of distribution, which reduce the consumption of the vast majority of society to a minimum level, only capable of varying within more or less narrow limits. Here, Marx is outlining the fact that capitalists set the limits to our consumption by manipulating the very free and unmanipulatable market to either allow or restrict consumption within the antagonistic and contradictory framework of capitalism. To Marx, personal consumption also allowed the individual to express themselves more freely. If we have the miserable capitalist Scrooge on one hand, then the other hand has actual choice, freedom of expression, and diversity. This is kind of a long quote, and I feel like I always put the emphasis on the wrong thing, but let's see if we do it. So Marx is saying here, self-denial, the denial of life and of all human needs, is political economy's principal doctrine. The less you eat, drink, buy books, go to the theater, go dancing, go drinking, think, love, theorize, sing, paint, fence is a long list, etc., the more you save and the greater will become that treasure which neither moths nor maggots can consume, your capital. The less you are, the less you give expansion to your life. The more you have, the greater is your alienated life and the more you store up of your estranged life. So here Marx is contrasting capital accumulation on one hand with being, living, and consuming on the other hand. In this view, the things that you can consume, or the things that you consume can become a part of you that capitalists that can't take away. And therefore, they can build you and fulfill you as a person. Of this long list, over half are acts of consumption of either goods or cultural products. Therefore, for Marx, one of the benefits of consuming is the ways in which consumption can allow someone to express freedom and personal development in our ever-changing identities. This is in contrast to some on the left who oppose consumer society for creating false desires in people instead of quote unquote genuine needs. In this view, the working class is completely manipulated, consumption zombies with no ability to think for themselves. We are seen as dupes who are easily swayed by big advertisers to spend tons of money on useless things. While we do need to acknowledge that a great deal of commercial culture is manipulative and of course filled with propaganda, the notion of the working class as a purely passive force unable to ever see through that is pretty unsocialist and counter to our political beliefs. Before moving on to pop culture, which I know is what everyone's here for, I'm going to quickly bring up a final piece to the puzzle, which is the idea of ethical consumption. This is the idea that each of us individually can choose to vote with our dollar, and then due to the laws of supply and demand, capitalism will eventually follow the will of the people and stop doing whatever exploitative practice was being protested. As we know, this is an individual response to a problem that is built into the system, and although it may solve a personal moral dilemma, it's not a way to make material change. This neoliberal concept of trying to create a more compassionate or greener capitalism is actually quite conservative and counter-revolutionary. So we'll come back to that later. I also need to make it clear when we discuss ethical consumption that there is definitely a place for strategic and organized non-consumption and critical anti-consumerism on the left. One example, of course, is BDS for the Free Palestine movement, or some types of consumption that attempt to address overproduction and environmental, disasters and whatnot. But we'll touch on this later. But of course, in order to be successful, this needs a mass movement of the working class. So as Marxists, our issue is not with consumption itself, but with capitalism. The relations of production under capitalism limit the freedom and personal development that consumerism inspires, while exploiting people and nature in a way that increases inequality and oppression. So consumption is good, but it often makes us feel really bad. So how do we as Marxists navigate consuming and enjoying cultural phenomenon even while the messaging and the production goes against our values? Since we currently live under capitalism, we know that our days are filled with the pressures and demands of work. The tendency for us is to seek the opposite of that in the little time that we have for ourselves. The basic needs for relaxation and pleasure can be met through a variety of activities, including but not limited to those listed by Marx in the earlier quote that we looked at. These activities can often offer respite from the horrors of capitalism, either through individual consumption, such as eating or drinking, active participation in things like sports, passive entertainment in the case of movies, TV, or concerts, or intellectual expansion through books, theorizing, etc. These activities are presented to us as choices, although as we now know, these choices are often restricted by capitalism itself. So as we move through the world today, we're inundated with these mass entertainment products. And of course, as people who are interested in creating a new world, we're often looking at the existing world through a political lens, and we use that to analyze our lived experiences. Because of this, we can deeply sense the tension and contradiction inherent in our life under capitalism. This has spawned a ton of catchy phrases and memes that we all tell ourselves. There's no ethical consumption under capitalism. My personal fave, all your faves are problematic. These things speak to the internal conflict that we feel, since some would even call it guilt, for consuming these capitalist cultural products as people who are acutely aware of the harm caused by their creation. Additionally, we know that much of mass art and mass entertainment, like everything else, is not only produced for a profit, but also produced with messaging that's harmful to the working class. On the left, this contradiction leads itself to a sense that enjoying these cultural products is somehow beneath us, that liking art that's turned out for a profit is a betrayal of the values that we hold. This links back to the argument that people who consume or participate in this type of culture are sheep, living in a false consciousness, etc. And as communists, we hold ourselves to some higher standard with our ability to see through and our refusal to consume capitalist propaganda. However, again, this is an argument that is built on the premise of the working class being unable to think for themselves, which is one that we reject. So although manufactured for profit, this type of media also reflects the genuine dreams, desires, aspirations, struggles, and even discontent of the masses. In fact, it must speak to all of these things if the general public is expected to connect with with this type of entertainment and consume it. As a result, much of popular culture reflects attitudes that exist in society as a whole, as well as the material conditions of the artist or creator. This can bring in all kinds of politics, from really awesome, cool ones to really nasty ones. And a layer of complexity, of course, is added when the politics embedded with the art can be contested depending on who's interpreting it. So for an example of how different politics can be read into the same piece of art, I think we all know this logo here. I don't know a super lot about comic books, as you guys can probably tell. I'm a pop culture girly, so or pop like music girl. So sorry if I mess this up, but The Punisher is a Marvel comic, and he was basically created to be like an anti-hero, vigilante sort of character. And his main thing was that he was a veteran, and when he returned from the war, which the war has changed depending on the time frame, his family was like murder, or his family witnessed a murder in Central Park, and there was like no justice after his family was murdered for witnessing the murder. So he basically like takes justice into his own hands, works outside the system to try to help other people who have been wronged. From what I can tell, the sort of creator of this character is just sort of a typical liberal. And of course, the Marvel audience is made up of a huge range of people with all kinds of contradictory beliefs. Of course, we know what's become of the Punisher logo in recent years, as the far-right military and police, I guess all the same thing, have all adopted it as a piece of their iconography. But the politics inherent in the character of itself are critical of the justice system, and the Punisher as a vigilante working outside of the system to deliver justice denied to citizens. The use of the Punisher logo by agents of the state is, as the creator himself has said, like putting a Confederate flag on a government building. He said that it's disturbing when he sees authority figures embracing the Punisher because the Punisher represents a failure of the justice system. After the uprisings in 2020, the comic book authors called on Disney, who's owned by Marvel, consumer choice, yay, to take action to prevent law enforcement from using the symbol. This conflict was resolved in an actual comic book when the Punisher comes across two cops who are fans of his. In the story, they take a picture with him and tell him how their work is very similar to his and show him a Punisher sticker on their car. The character rips up the sticker and says, "I'll say this once, we're not the same. You took an oath to uphold the law. You help people. I gave that up a long time ago. If you need a role model, his name's Captain America, and he'd be happy to have you." Just in this super short monologue, which is intended to distance the Punisher logo from police brutality, we can see a wild range of politics, including a strangely pro-cop argument in suggesting that cops hold up a just law, which is a strange thing to see coming out of this character's mouth. Shortly after this, Marvel also changed the logo of the Punisher to basically cut ties with police. So this provides a great example of the way that one single kind of media, when created for the masses, is open to interpretation based on who's engaging with it, and that ambiguity is often what makes something popular. Just as living under capitalism is often confusing and contradictory, so is consuming the cultural products that it creates. A second example of this was given in one of the materials for tonight, which was a talk given at Socialism 2012, I believe. And the speaker brings up a show that I think most of us probably remember, Will and Grace. This show ran from 1998 to 2006 and was like really praised in the press for advancing gay culture and educating the American public on LGBT issues. The speaker in the talk brings up a conversation that he had with a queer comrade of his, saying that he felt the show was super horrible. It was basically a queer minstrel show that capitalized and reinforced harmful stereotypes about queer identity. The friend listened and definitely politically agreed with all those points, and then said, "Yeah, but if it had been around when I was a teenager, I bet I would have felt less lonely." So as you can see, we often hold these contradictory beliefs even just within one person. We know that the stereotypes perpetuated and reinforced on Will and Grace were often harmful, yet for some in the working class and even some on the left, many may have felt seen in a way that they hadn't before. This also drives home an important point that I believe a comrade made a couple weeks ago in the meeting. You don't have to politically defend your emotional response or to something or your enjoyment of it. As people who are intent on looking at the world and seeing the systems of oppression through the lens of Marxism, of course we should be critical of what we consume, but that should not preclude us from consuming it, nor should the criticism of the art necessarily extend to an individual just for the act of consumption. So clearly, even as we are wanting to consume all of this media and everything, we also, as Marxists, want to consume things that are created ethically, and that's where this tension that we're talking about comes from. So I wanted to bring this around kind of all together. Popular culture is where a lot of the working class is, no matter what reason you assign to it, whether we're, consumption zombies or we just really like Taylor Swift a lot. The working class is engaging with mass entertainment media on a huge scale, and therefore it's an arena in which we can intervene as communists. We should be bringing our politics into spaces where people are enjoying content like this and organizing them into a movement that can smash the system of capitalism and replace it with a society that can freely create and consume art and other luxuries. There's a few ways of doing this. One way is to combine pop culture by using pop culture icons to advance a political message. This can be quite powerful regardless of what some may see as the political message of the art itself. The Punisher example illustrates how the right has taken a symbol created by mass media and claimed it to be so closely linked to their movement that Disney had to literally redo the logo in order to distance themselves from its new meaning. Another example of this, of sort of using these like pop culture iconography as a political sort of advancement, was an example also given in the Socialism 2012 talk concerning the original Avatar movie. The speaker himself calls the movie Dances with Blue Pocahontas for its what he feels to be liberal, white saviory sort of cringeness. However, a few years after it was released in 2010, some Palestine activists went to the wall between Palestine and so-called Israel, dressed as Blue Na'vi, feeling inspired by the movie's message, which they really connected to as an anti-imperialist message. Regardless of James Cameron's personal views on Palestine, if he has any, it spoke to the way that the people in different situations, both here in America and in Palestine, saw the same media and related to it differently, and how that can complicate the interpretation of art, even if that art is mass-produced to fund James Cameron's deep-sea diving hobby that he's still doing. There's also political context in which the consumption of or the identification with a piece of art becomes sort of a political flashpoint in the broader culture. And in those instances, we should be ready to intervene in the same way that we do in social justice movements, which is advancing class consciousness. Excuse me. An example of this would be a picket line held after last year's Oscars outside the Chateau Marmont in West Hollywood that Jay-Z and Beyonce hosted. At that time, workers at the hotel were on strike for a bunch of reasons, including job insecurity after COVID, and then also a culture of sort of general racial and sexual harassment at the hotel that went on for years. Workers had held dozens of events outside the hotel since 2020 to let the community and patrons know of the issues they were facing. And they even reached out to Jay-Z and Beyonce to ask that they hold the party elsewhere. The party was held anyway, and to probably none of our surprise, almost everyone that was invited attended. For those of you who want to know a list of who crossed the picket line, I'm happy to provide it, but it's my opinion that those details aren't politically important, just pettily important. I don't think Beyonce will have her feelings or her large bank account hurt if we decide to stop streaming Who Run the World on the way to protests. I know I'm not the only one. Or even if we stand solo outside her house with a sign. Instead, we should be bringing our politics into the space where people are engaging with them, such as a picket line, and organizing them into a movement that can smash the system of capitalism. As we know, it's much more beneficial to raise class consciousness than to try to change the mind of a few isolated rich people and artists. To tie this all together into one final and very recent example, I have to make my final confession of the night, but hopefully I don't have to frame it that way anymore, and hopefully everyone is just going to be nice to me. But I do have 2 Harry Potter tattoos, and so I think that's a great way to segue into personal consumption choices and activism in the public space, since the Harry Potter series and its very transphobic creator have been in the news quite a lot lately, with the release of a new Harry Potter video game. For those who don't know, but I'm sure most of us do, basically the creator of Harry Potter is a huge TERF and a billionaire, so double points, who continues to use her money and power to be extremely transphobic and loud. When it was announced that a new Harry Potter video game was coming out, a movement started online to asking people to sort of boycott this game in solidarity with the trans community. This, of course, quickly devolved into the usual online morality fighting over buying this specific game. However, the conversation never touched the exploitative system in which the video game was created, which directly harms all workers, including trans workers, in a very material way. This book that I'm holding in my lovely slide here, I just read recently, and in it, it's just the extremely taxing work conditions of video game developers, wage theft, discrimination, and oppression that they all face is described in pretty good detail, not to mention the slave labor involved in building consoles that video games are played on. The people benefiting and profiting from all of that exploitation are just as rich and just as right-wing as J.K. Rowling. Not buying Harry Potter's video game because of a transphobe would exclude you from pretty much ever buying anything, since everyone at the top is a transphobe who donates their money to very transphobic stuff. As an individual consumption choice, buying or not buying a video game doesn't make a material difference. A perhaps more constructive way to politically engage with this issue would be bringing attention to the fact that all video games are created with a line of exploitation and environmental destruction behind them. And the only way to fight that is through fighting the system that makes it so, not by trying to carefully navigate these systems with the least amount of harm. This tweet, before I say my last little thing, this tweet is my favorite Swiftie lore, so you guys can all enjoy it. So many see this as a pessimistic view. Everything in the world is owned by two people, so why even try? However, as revolutionary optimists, we can see this as an opportunity to raise class consciousness and see the real solution, which is a working class revolution from below. If we can bring class consciousness and these ideas to the people who are already thinking a little more critically about what they're consuming, pop culture can become a site for class struggle. So, of course, if there's ever a picket line in front of Taylor Swift's private jet, I will be there. But I'm sure you guys can guess what I will be listening to on my way over. The end.